Um, my name is Nina. I work at the Center for Agroecology, Water and Resilience, and I'm very pleased to be moderating this session today. And just, a few kind of little points before we start. This session is part of our Farming for Climate Justice webinar series. And that webinar series is part of a wider collaboration between CAWR, the center that I work at Coventry University in the UK, and the Bioeconomy Research Chair at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. And we've got funding from the British Council. And the sort of overall purpose of this collaboration is to build a network, an interdisciplinary network of early careers researchers in South Africa and in the UK, from academia and from civil society, with a focus on the transformation of food systems, food and farming systems. We'll support this emerging network to co-produce some transformative research, which will bridge different ways of knowing and which we hope will challenge colonial and extractive ways of doing research. This one today is the second of 3 weekly webinars. So please join us again next Wednesday on the 2nd of June at 3 p.m. GMT +1, which means 3 p.m. UK time and 4 p.m. South Africa time. The webinars are open to everyone, not just project participants, so please pass on the word. And also, to begin, I would like to clarify that our project starts from a recognition that a transition to agroecological farming is necessary, both from a point of view of resilience in the face of climate change, as well as from a point of view of social and ecological justice. And we're here to sort of dig into this in different ways and from different angles. And today's session is on the theme of nature-based solutions. And we have a panel of 5 glorious speakers who many of you will already know. Each speaker will give a short presentation of about 10 minutes. And I'm going to introduce them very, very quickly. They might tell you more about themselves. So we have Rachel Wynberg, who holds the Bioeconomy Research Chair at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. We have Michel Pimbert, who has been many things, but is currently director of CAWR, the Center for Agroecology, Water and Resilience at Coventry. We have Jasber Singh, who's a plant scientist turned critical social scientist with a wealth of experience in participatory action research. We have Ngcoya, who has a background in international relations theory and teaches in development studies at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, but only when he's not thinking about food, I've been told. And last but not least, we have Michel Belay, who probably best known for being the coordinator of the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa, and also for his strong links with the Africa Biodiversity Network. So please pose or make your comments, pose your questions or make your comments in the chat as we go along. We'll keep an eye on the chat, and we will invite some or maybe all of you to ask them out loud later, right after the panel presentations. And after that round of question and inputs, I understand that there might be a breaking out into breakout rooms for smaller group discussions, but there will be instructions on all of that later. Is that right, George? Instructions come later.
Yeah, we'll do instructions later. I think we won't go into breakout rooms today.
Okay.
We will go. We will open the floor to questions and hopefully get a bit of a discussion going.
Okay, great. So and that's all from me. So over to, is it Rachel? Are you starting?
No, it's Michel.
It's Michel. Okay, over to Michel. Michel, you have the floor.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I can't see you. I'm joining you by phone. I was one of the people who had Zoom problems. Rachel and I are going to set the stage, and I'll kick off just by giving a definition and highlighting some of the controversial issues around nature-based solutions. So for a bit of history, what are nature-based solutions? Well, the term emerged during negotiations under the UN Framework Convention of Climate Change in 2009. And nature-based solutions refers to a range of possible responses to the need for mitigation of and adaptation to climate change. Conservation organizations have been very much involved in shaping the concept, and the term was further defined in 2016 by the International Union of Conservation of Nature, IUCN, to mean, and I'm quoting here, actions to protect, sustainably manage and restore natural or modified ecosystems that address societal challenges effectively and adaptively, simultaneously providing human well-being and biodiversity benefits, end of quote. But the term nature-based solutions is a controversial one because it's often loosely defined and it can mean very different things to different people. In fact, NBS, in short, are highly contested, with many advocates defining nature-based solutions to suit their own activities they would like to see funded or implemented. And another reason why the term nature-based solutions is controversial is because some of its most enthusiastic supporters are large oil companies, agribusiness corporations, governments of wealthy countries with high greenhouse gas emissions, financial investors, and other industries responsible for much of the social and ecological crisis of our planet. And much of this controversy comes from the inclusion in nature-based solutions of actions to offset greenhouse gas emissions or actions that destroy nature in one area and which are offset by investment in creating, maintaining, and restoring natural and modified systems elsewhere. So you mine in one area, you're destroying the forest, and you offset those problems, those costs, social and environmental costs, by doing something nice elsewhere, restoring natural and modified systems elsewhere. So let's look at what Nestle, the world largest food company, is doing in relation to nature-based solutions. Well, Nestle, it's the biggest food company worldwide, and it's also one of the most corporate greenhouse gas emitters outside of the energy sector. Nestle's annual supply chain emissions are roughly double the total emissions of its home country, Switzerland. Its headquarters are based along Lake Geneva in Switzerland. Now, in December 2020, Nestle launched its net zero roadmap, committed to reduce its emission by 50% by 2030 and to net zero by 2050. And the majority of its emissions occur in its supply chain, especially in the sourcing of dairy, meat, and commodity crops, things like coffee, palm oil, sugar, soybean. But strikingly, Nestle's climate plans does not involve any reduction in the volume of its sales of foods based on dairy, meat, and other highly emitting agricultural commodities. Nestle's climate plan is instead based on a projected growth of 68% for both its sourcing of dairy and livestock products and of commodity crops between 2020 and 2030. Now, interestingly, Nestle claims that this growth in production will be more than compensated by the deployment of climate-friendly technologies and changes to farming practices amongst its suppliers. They'll be asked to adopt agroforestry, agroecology, and regenerative practice, capture carbon on farms and forest lands. And Nestle's roadmap for net zero carbon emissions is also based on the continued growth in sales of highly polluting products, offset by payments to others to store carbon back in the ground, primarily by protecting forests that are in danger of being cut down or by planting trees on degraded land. And Nestle's stated ambition to offset something like 13 million tons of CO2 equivalent a year with nature-based solutions would require zoning off or planting trees on at least 4.4 million hectares of land each year. And the expectation is that that process will generate a massive land grab for forests and farmlands, particularly in the global south. More generally, if you look at the agribusiness sector, the big agribusiness polluters like Nestle, Unilever, and Yara, the fertilizer company from Norway, They are now making net zero pledges, mainly to satisfy the public relation needs of their financial backers. And as they attract more finance and backing from government, corporate-led nature-based solutions are all set to trigger a massive new wave of land and resource grabs for indigenous peoples, peasants, and local communities, and this mainly in the global south. So if we step back and look at this, look, from a climate justice perspective, these corporate strategies are deeply problematic. First, offsetting greenhouse gas emissions against nature-based solutions elsewhere simply postpones the real reductions in emissions needed now, today. Second, it's a transfer of responsibility for reducing emissions to the poorest countries in the world and away from wealthy countries and corporations who, by offsetting their emissions, avoid any significant reductions in their levels of production and consumption. So fundamentally, the capitalist model of accumulation through dispossession is left unquestioned and unchanged. And finally, we'd say that potentially good solutions to combat climate change and injustice are co-opted, they're greenwashed, as they are made to fit and conform with the dominant regime. Now, an example of this is agroecology, and another is nature conservation, which I'll briefly highlight now. I'll say less about agroecology because my colleague Rachel will be touching on this a little bit more. But simply put, there are two visions of agroecology competing today. The first is an agroecology that largely conforms with the dominant agri-food system, and the second is an agroecology that aims to fundamentally transform the dominant system and the power relations that sustain it. So agroecological practices that conform include, for example, climate-smart agriculture that incorporates some agroecological practices like crop rotation, but basically continues to be committed to technologies of industrial agriculture, the use of herbicides to clear land in no-till farming, the use of GMOs and gene editing techniques. And generally, climate-smart agriculture aims to increase the efficiency of resource use, better targeting of fertilizers to use less, and promote substitution in otherwise unchanged monoculture farming, for example, replacing a toxic pesticide with a less toxic one. Now, these alternatives are really locked into the productivist, growth-oriented paradigm of conventional development. An agroecological science is made to fit and conform with the dominant paradigm and the nature-based solutions promoted by corporations like Nestle. In contrast, the more transformative agroecology, which we'll hear about later in the webinar, really tries to promote radical changes based on the redesign and diversification of agroecosystems through use of intercropping, agroforestry, agro-silvopastoral systems, farming much more in the image of nature, imitating the structure and function of natural ecosystems. And that transformative agroecology also seeks to reconnect biologically diverse farms with local and regional markets, linking producers and consumers in relations of proximity and greater solidarity. Now, that transformative agroecology, which Rachel will expand on a little bit more, and we can come back to this, it's interesting, that particular version of agroecology, that transformative agroecology, is under increasing attack from corporate lobbies who want a more shallow agroecology that supports business as usual. The agroecology that fits and conforms with the dominant model of production and distribution. The second area I want to talk about, and it is linked to agroecology, is to do with conservation areas as natural-based solutions. In 2009, the World Conservation Union, IUCN again, published a book entitled Natural Solutions, Protected Areas Helping People Cope with Climate Change. Now, the language of nature-based solutions has allowed conservation organizations like IUCN, WWF, the Nature Conservancy, to attract more funding for national parks and other protected areas, including through carbon markets and private sector investment. However, mainstream conservation in the Global South in particular largely relies on the Yellowstone model of national parks, in which local residents are forcibly displaced or denied access to resources they have historically depended on for their food, livelihood, culture, and spirituality. And violations of human rights obligations often lead to conflicts between affected communities and state authorities in and around protected areas. And that usually ends up compromising the goals of conservation and sustainable local livelihoods. Now, this fortress-style conservation model is actually gaining momentum. It's been criticized quite a bit, and I've been involved in criticizing, but it's sticking. It has formidable sticking power. And that fortress-style conservation model is really gaining more momentum in the run-up to the next Biodiversity and Climate Change Convention meetings in 2021. But backtrack a little bit. In 2010, the Convention on Biological Diversity adopted some targets for global biodiversity action, the so-called IKI targets. They call for 17% protection of the world's land area. Put 70% of the world's land area under protected areas and national parks. Today, there's a proposal that the original 17% target for 2020 be replaced to 30% under the new post-2020 global biodiversity framework. Now, given these more ambitious conservation goals, financial investments designed to help corporations offset their carbon emissions and reach net zero emissions are likely to fuel massive land grabs and displacement of indigenous and peasant communities in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. We're already seeing this in Peru, where the influx of foreign funding for nature-based solutions has meant that some national parks are being managed in ever more repressive and authoritarian ways, resulting in increased conflicts with local people and more food insecurity and malnutrition around protected areas. But yet there are other models of conservation possible. It's like agroecology. You have a conservation that conforms to the dominant regime and one that could be transformative. And these other models are possible with, by, and for people claiming their autonomy from disabling states and markets. So many indigenous peoples and peasant communities view some of these nature-based solutions as a way of enhancing their self-determination and autonomy. So, for example, in 2019, at the Climate Summit, indigenous peoples actually stated that, and I quote, "Indigenous peoples' knowledge systems are nature-based and honor the complex interdependence of all life forms. This is the root of success for the sustainable management of their resources, including waters, rivers, oceans, peatlands, forests, deserts, prairies, and savannas, developing effective solutions and practices for biodiversity conservation and climate change adaptation and mitigation. Securing the rights of indigenous peoples to their lands, territories, and resources can conserve and restore our most vulnerable ecosystems, increase the storage of carbon, scale out agroecosystems for sustainable food production, and restore harmony with nature and all life forms in partnership with states, donors, civil society organizations, and others, using a human rights-based approach. And we're hearing more about rights-based approach later from Jazz in particular. And we know that there are also several other examples of indigenous and community conserved areas. These are territories and areas collectively governed, managed and conserved by custodian indigenous peoples and local communities. What's more, there's overwhelming evidence that securing tenure for indigenous peoples and local communities is the most effective route to biodiversity conservation and climate mitigation. So unlike corporate nature-based solutions, these are people's solutions based on nature, culture, and human rights. And for many social movements, people's nature-based solutions are indeed rooted in principles of diversity, democracy, decentralization, economies of care and solidarity, cognitive justice, self-determination, rights, and autonomy outside of capitalism and patriarchy. So these are some of the themes that we will be exploring together in this webinar. Thank you very much. I hope I haven't overshot too much time-wise.
That's great. Thank you so much, Michel. I have the feeling that you're quite organized. Rachel, do you just want to sort of jump in there and organize the panel yourselves? Then I will not come in and interrupt again.
Thanks, Nina. Can you see my screen?
It's very small. Do you want to put it on main view?
Yeah, no, I'm
Yeah.
doing that right now. Yeah, is that good?
Wonderful.
Okay. So I'm going to switch my video off because I keep getting bandwidth warnings. So I'm just turning it off now, but it's not because I'm being antisocial. So good morning, good afternoon, and evening to everybody, old friends and new friends. Given the time short and building on what Michel has presented, I thought I would present 3 provocations that we can discuss. The first is that nature-based solutions are inherently political. I think we've heard that very, very clearly from Michel. Yet they're typically presented as a normative standard. So there's a win-win that for all, without acknowledging the very deep inequalities that are existing in our food and farming systems. And I don't think I need to remind this group that according to the IPCC, up to 37% of total greenhouse gas emissions are attributable to our food and farming system, from the intensification of fertilizer use, deforestation and land use degradation, through to food storage, transport, packaging, processing, retailing and consumption. And the figures Michel gave now for Nestle were pretty horrifying. Moreover, while in some parts of the world food systems are reducing hunger, these empty plates where quantity is prioritized over nutrition are leading to huge disease burdens, particularly with regard to non-communicable diseases such as diabetes and cancer. At the same time, there's been increasing and escalating control over both our food and seed systems. Farmers have progressively been separated from the means of agricultural production, such as seed, while the expansion of agribusiness and the global imposition of intellectual property rights has led to a concentration in the ownership of land, seed, and now genetic sequences. So an intensifying trend, which is illustrated in this great image by Phil Howard, has been the ongoing consolidation of the seed, agrochemical, and plant biotech industries, leading to the formation of so-called life science giants, with a series of mergers and acquisitions where the top 4 to 5 companies now control up to 60% of global commercial seed sales. And this has resulted in the concentration of resources, plant breeding, and seed supply in a limited number of hands, alongside growing fears of increased farmer and food dependency on just a few big companies. Jennifer Clapp and many others have written extensively about why this matters, why corporate concentration matters for sustainability, entwined as it is with industrial agriculture and associated increases in agrochemical use, in the loss of agricultural biodiversity, and many, many other problems. So any solution that aims to address the multiple crises we face has to address these patterns of ownership and control, and the economic system which underpins it, which we know is one predominantly based on economic growth and fixated on GDP as its primary measure of progress. So we therefore need to ask whether nature-based solutions are a transformative agenda that will bring the radical and systemic change that is needed in our food and farming systems, or whether it's simply business as usual, or, as we allude to in the title of our panel, old wine in new bottles. If we start to dig a bit deeper into the concept, then the answer becomes more apparent. And my second provocation, therefore, is that nature-based solutions, as currently framed, perpetuate a worldview that sees nature as separate from people, where nature continues to be commodified as marketable services, its so-called stock engineered in a network of green and blue infrastructure, and where new sites for capital accumulation are created in the hands of a global elite, often at the expense of those who remain poor, marginalized, without rights, and typically at the fringes. And in many ways, of course, nature-based solutions are simply an extension of what's gone before. There's not a lot new there. first taking off in the 1970s when the concept of so-called natural capital and ecosystem goods and services was touted by economists and ecologists. And this work was really important in bringing policy attention to the neglect of environmental damage in economic accounting and thinking, but it also laid the foundation for a very market-driven, instrumentalist and anthropocentric view of nature, existing only to service the needs of humankind and entrenching a very mechanistic and apolitical process of valuing nature and services like pollination or water provision, and using this in turn to set in place approaches such as payments for ecosystem services, or the REDD+ program, which Michel referred to earlier, which essentially allows polluting companies and countries to continue with a business as usual approach through very creatively offsetting these emissions by passing on carbon mitigation responsibilities to forest owners, who are typically communities in the global south. And this discourse of nature-based solutions continues to reflect these two very broad trends in this thinking. The first is the idea that markets are the most efficient regulatory tool, linked also to the belief that state regulation is inefficient and ineffective. And the second is that solutions to our crises lie not in asking hard questions about the drivers, but rather in looking towards modernization for more and better technology to solve the environmental crises that we face. I've tried to show this visually by comparing two documents. The one on the left is the IUCN standard, which has been brought out on nature-based solutions, and the one on the right is a word cloud from the wonderful book on agroecology written by Peter Rosset and Michel. And what clearly emerges is this contrast between the very managerial approach on the left of the IUCN standard, which is emphasizing criteria and interventions and management, versus the one on the right, which highlights food, farmers, systems, and social issues. My third and final provocation is that there are ways in which we can and must reclaim nature-based solutions through agroecology, and that we can do this by rooting food systems in diversity and agroecology and in human rights. As a broad church, nature-based solutions includes a suite of really, really important tools and practices which are absolutely critical for transforming agriculture. So principles such as enhancing soil biological activity, or enriching beneficial biological interactions and ecosystem functioning, promoting diversity at field and landscape level. These all underpin agroecology, but they mustn't be confused with conservation agriculture, which may be accompanied by the extensive use of herbicides, for example, or the very technocentric approaches of climate smart agriculture, which Michel has already described. So these do very little to address the transformative changes that are required. We need to be very clear about articulating these differences in these approaches. And in doing so, we need to recognize our very deep connections with the rest of nature, and that the separation of us and nature and its transformation into tradable commodities is actually part of the problem. We need to start thinking about different ways of approaching these questions, embedding different cultures, worldviews, languages, ways of knowing and doing in the discourse, as well as non-human beings, and where they fit and where we fit with non-human beings and who share the planet with us. Recognizing power and privilege in food, in agriculture and climate spaces, and ensuring the inclusion of indigenous peoples and the small-scale farmers, fishers, pastoralists, and forest dwellers, who continue to be custodians of 80% of the world's biodiversity, as this map shows. And last but not least, we need to bring in a rights-based and food and seed and sovereignty perspective, based on work done over many, many decades by the food sovereignty movement, to articulate a vision for fundamentally reshaping food systems and power relations, and in particular the viability of agroecology as a way of food production and management that builds on and stimulates natural processes in order to build resilience and productivity. And agroecology connects food sovereignty to climate justice And in so doing, it presents really, really exciting opportunities for transformative change that we need to seize now in appropriate ways. And with that, I'm going to close and I'm going to hand over to Jez, who will explore the interface with human rights in more detail. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. First, I just want to thank all the panel for their contributions so far, and thank Nina and George for inviting me to this seminar. I was asked to do a reflection on nature-based solutions and human rights. So I'm going to briefly touch on those two different issues and try and tease out some of the issues that our two speakers have talked about, kind of nature-based solutions as geopolitical, concentrations of power, and so on. So I'm just going to add a bit more texture to that. Okay, so nature-based solutions are being posed as a remedy to climate change, environmental degradation, and for addressing biodiversity loss. And these are key and massive challenges of the 21st century. So you can understand the anxiety of trying to deal with these issues. It's claimed that nature-based solutions are as much people-based as they are nature-based. So they're as much people-based as they are nature-based. But is this really the case? And that's something that I'm hoping we can go back to in the broader discussions. It'd be good to hear what other people think about that and their experiences and practices around that. But what does this mean, this kind of people-based? What does it mean politically? And I'm really interested in what this actually means politically. Is nature-based solutions another form of post-political environmental issues? Is it beyond politics? Is the crisis beyond politics? So that's what I really want us to reflect on. And of course, I don't have the answers to these, but it'd be nice to have a discussion around that. So what's happened in the past is that the grand narratives around the environment, be that nature-based solutions now, or be that nature conservation projects that Michel were talking about, or REDD+, biofuels, and the like, they can elide the lived experiences of the daily challenges that many oppressed groups face in terms of their rights. But more importantly, equally importantly, can also raise the historical way in which communities have been living with local ecologies. So in some environmental projects, there has even been dispossession, as Michel has noted, of communities from their land and territories under the guise of conservation. We mustn't forget this and fall into a colonial amnesia when reflecting on emerging environmental policies. So my concern is that nature-based solutions have glossed over questions of existing power relations, history, and human rights. Have proponents of nature-based solution, borrowing here from Orwell's Animal Farm, recognize that we are all equal, but some are more equal than others. To illustrate the point that some are more equal than others, the world's richest 80 people own as much as the bottom half of the global population, a real concentration of power and capital. So that's around 80 people own as much as about 3.5 billion people, and I'm sure the figures are changing. And these figures are probably aren't new, but I'm just trying to label the point. There are around 690 million people that go hungry, and this figure is going to rise, and that figure is very gendered. So there's patriarchal power within these numbers. These inequalities speak to a global system which is characterized by concentrations of power, the accumulation by dispossession, and stark and burgeoning intersectional inequalities, often on interlocking lines of race, gender, caste, sexuality, and class and disability. So these are equally massive challenges of the 21st century. And, you know, I say this quite a lot, but Stuart Hall, somebody I really admire, an anti-racist campaigner in the UK, he talks about the key challenge of the 21st century is dealing with difference, dealing with questions around race and gender and intersectionality. So I'm not disputing these environmental challenges are important, but so are equally important of the other key challenges around discrimination and difference. Do nature-based solutions heavily lean into this complex intersectional class, gendered, caste, difficult and messy political worlds. We actually live in a very complex and difficult and messy world, and I'm not sure, well, I'm pretty sure that nature-based solutions do not engage with that deeply. So, going to human rights. In my understanding, the question of human rights and environmental protection are often kept apart and separate. And the last speaker, I think, talked a bit more about the philosophical reasons why that's happened. So a key challenge, therefore, is how do nature-based solutions, whether that's agroecology or so on and so forth, the ones that are transformative, how do we productively integrate a thick human rights perspective alongside an environmental narrative? And I think that's something that we could productively think about together. At the moment, generally, human rights approach is quite thin within environmental narratives and policies. And again, I think we can dig deeper on how we can actually get there. Okay, before I connect human rights and environmental issues more broadly and how they've emerged in social movements, right to food and so on, I briefly want to touch on human rights. And the reason I want to touch on, just given a brief history of human rights, I always want to flag that human rights are also problematic. So we've got a tension there. Human rights have a long and problematic history in nations. I'm going to pick on the UK because I know it better than any other country. In the UK, they can be traced back to the Magna Carta around 1215, highly problematic document in terms of concentrating power. However, how we understand human rights can arguably link to the foundations of contemporary human rights, can be rooted in around 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So I think that's probably the popular way we think about human rights at the moment. And rights in many late capitalist countries are often framed in the negative. And this is quite important because which I mean by that is that rights can't be taken away from the excesses of the state, the right to education, the right to religious freedom, the right to family life, etc. However, there's a growing movement for this to be expanded further where states positively bring about change rather than sit on the idea that states can infringe on political and civil liberties. As such, social, cultural and economic rights are often a key demand of many social movements. And these types of rights can potentially address some of the intersectional challenges that I talked about in terms of race, gender, etc., intersectionality. To illustrate, the right to food has been claimed by social movements across the globe, agroecology, food sovereignty, to address this question around access. And importantly, these kind of rights-based models in terms of cultural rights around the right to food are also being taken up by by wealthier nations as well. So the right-based approach, which I like, is a way to provide a guarantee that production does no harm and that people can get access to food, which poverty and intersectional discrimination prevents. So furthermore, social movements on agroecology and food sovereignty have also advanced gender rights and in the recognition that male power and patriarchy within society and within structures is still a massive problem that we need to deal with. The right of peasants, indigenous communities have also advanced the strengthening of the human rights foundation within food sovereignty and agroecology discourses. And I think is fundamental in agroecology being a transformative agenda. That rights-based foundation is absolutely fundamental. And I'm also going to just talk a little bit about indigenous rights and how important they are, because indigenous rights for me talk about something that is really clear to me, and that is structural racism. So these rights have been posed as a form of protection against the discrimination and race-based oppression, which is an everyday lived reality. So in these contexts, rights imagined incredibly politically, and that's how I'd like to imagine rights, in a very thoroughly and utterly political way. Importantly, rights-based models ensure that the lived experiences of people aren't buried away in social, ecological, biodiversity discourses, kind of noise, the noise of this kind of ecological agenda that's being pushed by nature-based solutions. And of course, ecological ideas have historically emerged through colonial Eurocentric logics, as such ecologies are thus sites of complex historical and political power relations. It's not culturally a neutral framing. It is completely and thoroughly linked to culture, and that culture was a Eurocentric culture. So the culture, Eurocentric culture and ecology is co-manifest. And I think it's important that we put that on the table. Whilst I'm a big believer of rights, and I think it's absolutely important we keep it on the table, there are limitations to rights. And there are challenges in integrating other ontological cosmovisions, especially around collective rights. It's quite difficult to integrate those in the current liberal framework of rights. Cultural practices are often marginalized. Cultural formations of identity and place and belonging and spirituality, they're very difficult ideas to integrate and fit into the individual rights model. So rights models are also can be ahistorical. Here, I mean, the rights model glosses over historical regions of oppression, inequalities, and environmental degradation. And for me, these oppressions can be rooted in the onset of European imperialism that enslaved and colonized. And these inequalities and environmental degradations are often not on the table when we're thinking about rights. And I think that's really important to think about. Furthermore, indigenous communities and anti-racist activists have also shown us there is no such thing as post-colonial. Colonial power continues to circulate. The structures of the world economy and many states continue to be marked by intersectional, racialized, and gendered logics. In other words, it is impossible to separate racism, sexism, heteronormativity, intersectionality from contemporary social and environmental relations. We can't keep them separate. It's impossible. Okay, to conclude, many communities have been living with nature for centuries. And I'm worried that history, this lived reality, is not being fully recognized as new policy frameworks are being pushed forward at speed to deal with the environmental crisis. And being pushed forward at speed is really important. I think we need to keep an eye on that. It appears that nature-based solutions fall into a form of colonial amnesia and fail to lean into the complex side of power relations and politics. As such, human rights need strengthening, as human rights could be potentially violated by nature-based solutions if we draw on the lessons from REDD+, nature conservation and biofuels. As such, the universal rights approach provides a language to make stronger claims against violations, but it also gives it a legal personality, and I think that's quite important as well. Having said that, deeper work needs to be done. The colonial project, which created the other to separate nature from humans, and importantly, humans from humans, so the European imperialism could extract, exploit, and violently dominate, is important to keep on the table. Because the idea that Europeans were superior and Black, indigenous, and people of color and nature were inferior justified extraction, slavery, colonialism, mass exploitation. The very genesis of epistemologies of nature are rooted in the colonial. And rather than gloss over this, we need to lean into it. And I'm unconvinced that nature-based solution really does in a thorough, deep, convincing way. So we need to look at strengthening the rights as a way to face power relations. But we also need to be more imaginative and foreground decolonial approaches when developing farming system that affirms the rights of the oppressed and nature. We also need to accept the limitations of rights, particularly around the collective, the commons, and spirituality. As such, we need to do the heavy, heavy, heavy work of decentering the stubborn Eurocentric gaze and its power to other people and nature, and develop transformative, decolonizing agenda that foregrounds power relations as the starting point of new environmental imaginaries. Okay, thank you. Hello?
That's great, Jas. Thank you so much. Yes, we're still here. So next on our panel is, I think it might be Mu. Is that right, Mu?
Yeah, it's me. It's me, yes. I'm also like Rachel, I'm also struggling with bandwidth. So you'll excuse me if I turn off my video. It's not because I'm shy. Yeah, it's just to save my internet connection here. I'm in a small rural area in the province of KwaZulu-Natal. in the beautiful country of Africa South, and I work at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in the city of Durban. But more importantly, I'm also a farmer. So I hope that what I am going to present today will gel well with what my colleagues here have presented already, and especially the ideas that I hear from Jasper concerning humans and their rights. Who are humans that we deal with? What rights are we talking about? Where is the place of history, etc.? And also, I hope I'm going to give a little bit more texture to some of the ideas that Rachel talked about in terms of what indigenous perspectives, what indigenous relations with land, with nature really look like, and what that means for these so-called new ideas on nature-based solutions. So I also am struggling a little bit with my technology here. So I'll ask, I sent around a PowerPoint. So I hope one of you, one of the organizers can share the screen or share the PowerPoint so that we can go along. So I've basically titled my presentation, Ukuzimilela, Indigenous Plants and Decolonial Imaginations of Climate Justice. Ukuzimilela is a Zulu word, and as we've heard again today, the issue of language is quite important in this discussion because we speak in the language of the colonial masters, which has its own limits. And certain concepts and ideas and words that come from subjugated people across the world really do not flourish or are not heard. So Ukuzimilela basically is a word that I've come across, that I've heard from a lot of farmers that I've followed over the last 8 years in this province of KwaZulu-Natal, where they say that the reason why they grow particular things, the reason why they find collaboration with particular plants is because those plants have certain emergent properties that allow them to auto-propagate. So they grow on their own. Ukuzimilela basically means that the plant has the ability to thrive, to flourish without too much human intervention. So Ukuzimilela is what I'm really interested in. In other words, what kind of relationship do we foster? What kind of relationships do we organize so that all people, all plants, all creatures can have this emergent power to self-propagate, to grow on their own, auto-growth as it were. So thanks to the inspirational work of one farmer, this is slide 2 of my presentation, whose name is Ngcoya, and this work that I'm presenting now, and a lot of the work that I've written about agroecology in South Africa is really inspired by her. And it's a collaboration between her, myself, and my colleague, Naren Kumara Singh. So the work really focuses on the work of this woman. The academic and intellectual work that is produced focuses on the work of this woman, Ngcoya, who passed away in December 2020, who was also known simply as Gogo Ko. She died at about age 72, and she was a farmer, a scientist in her own right, a thinker, a philosopher in many ways, and a practitioner of ancestral ways of farming, agroecology, if you choose. So she was never really married and had a daughter and 4 grandchildren, one of whom passed away a few years ago. And so this is really the ideas that I'm presenting are really inspired by her. So slide 3 is, I'm showing here pictures of some of her work. This is Ngcoya, one of her favorite plants, also known as amaranth in English. Ngcoya, and it has many names in African languages here. This was one of her favorite plants, and she grew about 16 varieties of this plant, Ngcoya, an old indigenous plant herb, and this this is grown or grows on its own throughout the marginal soils in Southern Africa, and people love it. It's a vegetable eaten like one would eat spinach. And so the next slide is a tree called the wild almond tree. And the reason I'm interested in these things, in these trees and plants, is because they are also monuments. Plants are also monuments. They tell history. I was really happy to hear Jasper talk about historical stuff. That the reason why farmers like Ngcoya produce on marginal soil in matchbox types of properties is really because of all the colonial removal, the dispossession that has taken place, that has hemmed them in, so that they really can't grow themselves. So the wild almond tree is an old tree. It's an indigenous tree in Southern Africa, and it tells a story of domination also, because it was one of the plants or one of the trees that formed the first colonial border in Southern Africa. So that's what focusing on plants and looking at people-plant relationships also does. It allows you to explore history because plants and trees remember. The next slide again is the milkwood tree, also centuries old and common also in Southern Africa. And again, here's another tree that has historical memory of enslavement. It has historical memory of people rising up against the Dutch and rising up against the Portuguese explorers in the 1500s. So again, this emphasizes the fact that our relationship with plants and trees, at least in the Southern African region where I'm based, is quite complex, because this is the work that tells history. This is the work that explains to a lot of us why things are the way they are. Why an old woman like Ngcoya, if you go to the next slide, are hemmed in by what I call the plantation logic. So I find the work around plantation or the plantational scene quite important and quite revealing, because it helps us locate the current crisis that we're facing in terms of the plantation logic. So the plantation logic really for me is a useful concept that was developed at least in the 1970s already by a Caribbean philosopher named Wynberg, who makes this useful distinction between a plantation society and a plot society. So according to her, in a classic plantation society, the idea of planting is broader and deeper than merely planting crops. So plantations are planted with people, not to form societies, but to carry on plantations whose singular purpose is to plant monocrops for the market. So writing about the Caribbean, she says plantation societies came into being as adjuncts of the market and people as adjuncts to the singular crop. So the plantation society, however, comes into conflict with plot society, the world of indigenous people whose main preoccupation is planting for human needs. So the plantation was a superstructure of civilization, and the plot, the roots of culture. This is actually what Sylvia Winter is talking about. So Ngcoya then is growing, or was growing her crop, trying to create livable collaboration in the small town of Ngcoya, totally hemmed in by large plantations actually of sugarcane, of eucalyptus. So the paper industry in South Africa is based, a lot of their plantations are in this part of the world, and the sugar plantations, etc. So and the reason why she does not have land to produce herself, to recreate herself, is largely due to the fact that there is this plantation logic that not only governs the geographic spaces that she occupies, but that governs all of society. So the emphasis on large-scale cultivation, cultivating single exotic crops. So Ngcoya then was able to plant herself, to grow herself, despite the preponderance of the plantation logic. So she tried to recreate livable collaboration together with her plants, together with her neighbors and community around her, against the idea of monocultures and monocropping. She had a diversity of plants, both trees, herbs, fruit trees, medicinal plants, and she also hardly distinguished between medicinal plants and simply just culinary plants or fruit trees, etc. For her, this was one and the same. So this is the part that Sylvia Wynter talks about as plot society or provision ground. That the world of provision ground is what we need to focus on. At least this is what my experience tells me, that the solutions are not going to come, I'm sorry, they're not going to come from Europe. Europe has done its part. They're not going to come from North America, at least as far as I'm concerned. When we really think about change, when we want to think about transformation, we need to go beyond Europe. And the provision ground, people like Ngcoya, other people, at least for me, who seem to show us the way that the future will be when we increase biodiversity, not only of just plant and animal life, but of human life as well. When we increase the diversity of our experiences, when we increase the diversity of our relations and relationships, and emphasize livable collaboration. So if we go to the next slide, these are some of the things that then Ngcoya is working against, because the plantation logic, as I said, is not simply just nature. It is not simply trees or sugarcane. It is also industry. Right around here with these food chains and stores and fast food stores that are promoted right next door to her. The logic of the plantation extends beyond simply agriculture. It dominates and goes deep into the economy itself, and it also organizes the way that we live. So the next slide is then Ngcoya's provision ground. This is what Ngcoya was producing on marginal soil, crazy diversity of crops, of vegetables. Next slide, please. Of all types, tubers. This is patata, sweet potato, and a variety of plants, some of which she did not know. I remember meeting her once and asking her why she was growing a particular herb that I saw flourishing in her garden. And she says, no, I don't know this plant. And I say, Ngcoya, why did you grow? So what do you mean you don't know this plant? You are ancient, you are old, you are supposed to know things. I'm here to learn. She says, no, I do not know this plant. I say, where did you get it? She says, there was an earth mover that was working nearby, clearing the land. And I saw this young fellow lying on the ground, and I felt mercy towards him. I rescued him and I brought him home. That kind of sensibility, friends, is what I'm talking about, where our relationship with plants is beyond extraction, where she was not growing things because they did something for her, but she says, I felt sorry for this little guy. I felt sorry for this little fellow. So that's the kind of relationship that Ngcoya had with her plants. And it's a kind of livable collaboration she tried to inculcate. And it's the kind of thing that I think will be useful for us when we think about this work. So the next few slides, again, you can just go through them quickly. I know I'm running out of time. I could talk about this forever. Again, historical time that is produced by Europe says we should talk for 10 minutes. I'm sorry, this does not work, but we shall work with it. So yeah, these are some of the plants. She didn't smoke marijuana, but she thought it was useful because it did something for her chest, etc. And then she made amazing food. She cooked amazing food, and this is her in her garden. So in conclusion, because I'm out of time, the question that we need to ask then, I think, is when we say human, when we say the problem is the Anthropocene, which anthropos are we talking about? Which humans are we talking about? When we say nature, which nature? Are we talking about first nature, which basically means just ecological interactions? Or are we meaning second nature, which is the way that capitalism uses nature? Or are we talking about third nature, which is the nature when we think about things that happen despite capitalism, things that happen on the margins? At least this is the way that the anthropologist Singh talks about nature, that we need to think about nature in this third category. the ways in which people collaborate, the way in which people live, despite the machinations, despite the intentions of colonialism and capitalism. And when we think about the new arrangements, the nature-based solutions, if you will, shouldn't we be asking whether these new arrangements, or does this wine, to use Rachel's metaphor, do these bottles create or recreate the plantation logic, or do they promote provision grounds? Do they promote livable collaboration? So perhaps we should say to nature-based solutions, no BS, please. Thank you.
That was fascinating. Thank you so much, Mu. Million, I think you're the next and last speaker of this panel.
Sorry. Thank you very much. I'm trying to put my slide. Thank you very much for really excellent presentations. Very exciting. I hope mine wouldn't bore you. My name is Belay. I'm the General Coordinator of the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa. It's the biggest network in Africa. Our members work in almost all of African countries. We have farmers, fisher folks, indigenous peoples, pastoralists, women networks, youth networks, and also faith-based institutions and civil society organizations as members. So, speaker, what I'm going to do now is I'm not going to talk about nature-based solution, but I'm going to talk about one of the 6 very exciting, what we call decolonizing projects that we have. The 4 presenters really spoke to the need for questioning some of the coming initiatives into the world and also into Africa. What I'm going to talk about is one of our solutions. So on one hand, you question, on the other hand, you propose a solution. So I will focus on a solution, the solution that we have agreed in 2018 as the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa is to work on food policy for Africa. AFSA has a goal. One of the central goals of AFSA is to promote a transformative form of agroecology. But in 2018, we thought that I think we should consider also system level work. This system level work is developing a food policy. I will explain the process. The goal, the final goal of our work is to work for sustainable, healthy diets in Africa. So how do we understand these sustainable, healthy diets? These are dietary patterns that promote all dimensions of individual health and well-being, have low environmental pressure and impact, are accessible, affordable, safe, and equitable, and are culturally acceptable. So this is a definition by FAO. We are working for this. But as you know, we have challenges. Both the presentation from Rachel and also the DJs have talked about increasing in hunger and micronutrient deficiencies and increase in obesity. You all know this. And increase in communicable disease. So health and hunger are a problem and a challenge, and they are parts of the food system. And the current food system is not environmentally sustainable. It's environmentally unsustainable. And you can see the list here. And there are also a lot of social inequities, poverty, disempowerment. And in relation to the last presentation, also neglect of cultural values. These are all critical elements of the system, the food system, but these are under attack by the current food system. And we think that, I think, partly by fixing the policy, the food policy in Africa, we can also fix some of these problems, because the policies are translated to strategy and to action in Africa. But what are the, what do we talk about when we talk about food policy? These are the food we eat and the food systems we enjoy are shaped by a variety of distinct and disparate policy frameworks: agriculture, food safety, public health, nutrition, trade, environmental protection, climate and energy. All of this affect the food that we eat and the food system that we have. But the policy formulation in Africa has different challenges, a very, very critical challenge. The first is we are working under a wrong narrative, the narrative of productivism. This is what Michel was talking about. The narrative that we operate in says that, we have, we need business to feed ourselves. Our seeds are tired and African plants are tired, so we need super seeds. We need agrochemicals to produce food. Land in the hands of farmers is not productive, so we need to give this land to both inside and outside actors to make it more productive. NBS is also part of one of the wrong narrative, nature-based solution. And the narrative says that we have to redirect or transform African agriculture to be market-based, market-based narrative. So we are operating under this wrong narrative, and it appears to be in the DNA of most of our decision makers. And most of our policies are influenced by outside actors. You all know the influence of the Gates Foundation alone in our policy environment. They are changing policies and regulations and laws in almost all of African countries. So there's a lot of outside influence. And there is little space for social movements, and AFSA members are challenged in every country that they operate in. We are also in a challenge as a regional organization, and the policy environment is not open for us. And the policies, as we shall see, are incoherent. One policy says one thing and the other policy says something. And also our continent on ground, there are hundreds and thousands of innovations, and they are not reflected in our policy. So we need to have a policy. So what is the need? There are conflicting objectives, as I said, and they're costly and inefficient. And there needs to be integration across governance levels. One government body does something, another government body does totally opposite to this government body. So there is no speaking to each other, or there is no coordination, as we know. And we need a government for transition, a transition to sustainability, to the kind of food system that we want. And we need to encourage the participation of people, which is a democratic decision-making. So what is the purpose of African food policy? We have to determine the direction of travel for food system. As it's happening now in almost all African countries, the direction is not to sustainability, as you all know. Every country that I know in Africa has espoused this productivist paradigm. So we have to break into that paradigm and that narrative, and we have to redirect our food system. And we have to bring all the sectoral policies on production, processing, distribution, and consumption parts of the food system together. And we have to refocus the transition, African transition, to sustainability. So what will be the outcome of this food policy work? I will tell you how it's happening. We will identify conflicting objectives of existing policies, and we'll explore potential for synergies, and we'll propose a new governance structure for food systems. As I will say later on, this is even happening as I speak in some African countries. And we have to put a concrete vision And we have to mobilize actors for a better food vision. This is already happening, you know, the dialogues are happening in so many African countries, and wherever they're happening, people are pushing for a better vision on the food system. So these are the actors who are participating in this food policy dialogues: farmers, fisher folks, pastoralists, food entrepreneurs, faith-based institutions, civil society, policymakers. This includes government individuals, you know, government representatives, even the parliament. Scientists and the media are included. And how are we doing it now? Both at the African level, at the regional level, and at the country level, there will be a coordinating body. In Rwanda, for example, the parliament, the research institutions, the civil societies, faith-based institutions are sitting in the coordinating body. At the African Union level, there is African Union Commission, there is AFSA, there is FAO Africa, WFP Africa. So there are coordinating bodies to do that. And we have developed a roadmap, both for country level dialogues and also for regional level dialogues. And we did also a regional study. This regional study was finalized, but the African Union sent it around and to experts in Africa, and it's coming back for a further increasing of, strengthening of the regional study. A very interesting observations. Some of the institutions say no, this doesn't include digitalization of food, involvement of business, and some saying, oh, this is fantastic, it's really good. So we are getting different responses from African actors. Regional dialogues are going to happen in the future in Addis Ababa. We couldn't do it last year and this year, obviously due to COVID. Country level dialogues are happening. I'll tell you in how many countries. Finally, a final report will come out, and the final report will be presented hopefully in October when African ministers meet, and that's planned. So advocacy at the national and AOC level. And finally, these two slides, there are 24 countries having this dialogue now. From East Africa, Kenya, Ethiopia, Rwanda, Tanzania, and Uganda are having it. West Africa, Burkina Faso, Mali, Senegal, Togo, and Benin. Southern Africa, Malawi, Zimbabwe, Zambia, South Africa, and Mozambique. The Congo Basin countries, DRC, Cameroon, Gabon, Republic of Congo, Central African Republic, and Congo Brazzaville, Anglophone West Africa, Ghana, and Nigeria, North Africa, Tunisia. And all of them are doing it in their own way, in a different way. And we are seeing very interesting results. Two of them, for example, Rwanda, the parliament even asked for a food policy. They asked the coordinating body, bring the food policy, then we introduce it into the parliament. Democratic Republic of Congo, a very active country. Again, they are working with the parliament, and the government is deciding that we should have a country level food policy. And at the African Union level, there's already a decision that this food policy is needed. Not a formal decision, but an understanding. So these are the countries where these food dialogues are happening. The North African countries, the dialogue is happening in Tunisia, but Tunisians are looking also at the food policy of these three countries, Morocco, Algeria, and Egypt. And when it's finalized, we will have a representative reflection from the continent. Thank you so much.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. Those were absolutely fantastic presentations. I hope you agree with me there. I'm going to pass over to George to facilitate the discussions now.
Thank you, Nina. Thanks. And thank you all for persevering with your different devices. I think actually we're going to take a 5-minute comfort break. And then if you, in the meantime, if you have any other questions to ask, pop them in the chat and I'll invite you to ask your questions. But shall we just have a quick break for 5 minutes, and we'll see you back here in 5. And thank you to all the speakers.
Sounds great. See you in 5 minutes.
So I didn't have my stopwatch on at all, so I have no idea where the 5 minutes has gone by, and we should have had some elevator music playing in the background so there wasn't silence.
I think it's maybe just sort of like 4 minutes. I didn't look exactly, but I think we still maybe have a little moment.
Great. Well, if anybody is around and can hear us, then make your way back.
Hello.
Hi, Michel.
Hello, I'm back.
Great. Thank you. So sorry not to be seeing you.
No worries, I'm glad at least this worked.
And we're very hugely relieved.
I'll have to get to the root of this. I just don't understand. I was going round in circles in a closed loop, going to the registration. Anyway, I'll explain later, but it's strange, but never mind.
It's very strange indeed, and you're not alone in having these problems, but thanks to you and Nina for persevering.
That makes me feel a lot better that I'm not alone.
So I'm going to pull us back because we now have 20 minutes for questions, and I think from some of the questions that we've seen in the chat already that we may kind of open to discussions, so they may take a little bit longer, but I was interested, so I'm going to flip over to the questions here. I think from Adam, a very kind of generic question about the co-option of agroecology as it's gained more legitimacy. Adam, would you like to ask your question? And I think maybe it's potentially for Michel and Rachel to get their view.
Sure. I think the one sense is to be disheartened by the co-optation of agroecology and diluted into its various other forms, climate smart, nature-based.
See you trying, but we can't hear you.
Hello.
We can.
I could hear Adam, George. I don't know what was going on. I could hear him very well. Yeah. Continue, Adam.
I can hear Adam too.
Yeah, continue.
Okay.
I can ask the question if you'd like.
George, you seem to have lost sound because we can hear Adam.
Okay, I'm going to jump into the questions. And so basically, Adam was saying that agroecology has now made the mainstream, but one of the challenges with that is its co-option and its watering down. And can either Michel or Rachel talk to that and how that's potentially resisted, how we respond to that in agroecology?
Rachel, shall I have a first stab?
Yeah, go ahead.
Rachel,
okay.
You're on
Thank
mute.
you very much, Adam, for that. Oh, sorry.
No, actually, Michel, we could hear
Michel,
you
now
well.
you're on mute.
No, yeah, it's because George can't hear us. So this is creating a very
George,
strange situation.
You have a problem, George.
Yes, George has
Nina,
a
you're
check your sound system.
You.
Can someone send a message to George?
I am trying to reach her. Just continue
Great.
speaking. We just speak and we'll let her know that it's not
Adam, thank you very much for that question. It's not unusual for ideas that have a radical edge to be diluted, co-opted, disciplined. This has happened with words like participation, sustainability, quality of life, appropriate technology. So this is not new. I think what's hopeful today is that whilst industry
can you hear me?
Industry lobbyists are trying to domesticate agroecology and bring into the line with their own vision of development. There is today a growing movement from below involving farmers, indigenous people, in urban and rural areas that are politicizing the concept of agroecology. and putting it in a much larger normative framework, the framework of food sovereignty, autonomy, decolonization, and that's gaining momentum. Ultimately, however, what will happen will depend on the balance of social forces between industry and corporations, and also the financial sector, which is very powerful and currently engaged in a massive restructuring of the food system using new technologies like the fourth industrial revolution technologies. And a lot is at stake for them to ensure that business as usual prevails. Agroecology is explicitly, at least among the more transformative camp, about exiting commodity capitalism. It's about a very different economic system that structures and mediates production, distribution, processing, and consumption, and waste management. So it's an important battle of ideas going on right now, and I don't think either side can say it has won, if you want to put it in those terms. What's striking is that agroecology as a concept was nowhere to be seen 10 years ago. It was quite taboo to talk about agroecology in many circles. And what we now see is that agroecology is very much present on the radar screen of policymakers, donors, but also social movements. It's increasingly coming into seminars like this, in teaching. So it can take different directions depending on the actors, the actor networks that align with it. That's what I would say, and I'll stop there because I'm sure Rachel would like to build on what I'm saying or perhaps give another complementary perspective. I could say more, but I want to stop now to give a chance for Rachel to talk.
Yeah, thanks, Michel. I'm not sure, I mean, you gave a beautifully comprehensive response. I'm not sure I can add much more to that. But yeah, I mean, I also see it as something that we can use constructively. The fact that the language is now in international spaces. I think it's an opportunity for us to define it in the way we see it. And it gives it a platform that I think we didn't see before. So I see both positive and negative aspects to it.
Yeah. And if I may add, I completely agree, Rachel. Adam, if I may add on this one, I think it depends largely on how bold social movements are, peasant organizations, outer globalization types are. I think we really have to spell out the cultural, political dimensions of agroecology and the normative framework around, a language of freedom, democracy, autonomy, the pluriverse, etc., and be extremely bold in pushing that, and not be too timid to try and use language that will convince the policymakers or not offend powerful actors. I think we've passed that. We're in a moment where things are really falling apart. We don't have much time to turn things around, and I think we have to be very bold in our proposals and very frank about the value base, the ideologies that are constitutive of a radical transformative agroecology, and the civilizational project behind it, which is quite different from what capitalism, patriarchy, and authoritarianism will reproduce, encourage, etc.
Thank you, Michel. I'm going to take over from George, who has lost our sound, and ask the next person to step up. And so Vincent, or Vincent, I'm not sure, Cheng, have you had a question, I think for Michel, on polycultural structure? Would you like to come in and ask your question?
Hi, hello, can you hear me all?
Hi,
Yes,
we
I can
can.
hear you.
Hi,
Yeah.
good evening all, good evening all. I think in regards to I believe that was directed to Jasper Singh, not Michel, I'm afraid. Yeah, I do.
Yes, that doesn't, that's fine. Just
That's
ask.
fine.
Now
That's fine.
now I've asked you, just ask your question, whatever
Okay.
it was.
Oh, okay. I think you perhaps you may have confused me with someone else. I was just thank you for the talk, anyways. Professor Pimbert, it was very, very interesting. If that's the only thing I can add. I don't think I have anything to ask. I do apologize there. But thank you anyways, Monsieur Pimbert.
That's
All
fine.
right,
Thank you.
forget about the professor bit. My name's Michel. That's good enough.
Merci, anyways.
Chloe, did you have another question about bottom-up resistance of producers and resource users, or it was maybe more a commentary?
Yeah, it was maybe just sort of both. Someone else mentioned that like the changing the system from the top down is difficult because the power is so already co-opted by oligarchs and sort of big single players. And so I was just, sort of wondering out loud if anyone had any thoughts on kind of in practical terms, if a community was like, right, how should we organize ourselves and how should we be farming to start to take some of that power back, but not so much like in an individual community gaining power, but what kinds of things would sort of undermine the global power? Like, I suppose one example I always think of is that if you have more kind of agroecological productive strategies, you have less need for inputs, so you're not paying for them, so you're not contributing to that power structure. But I feel like that's very basic and simplistic. So maybe some of the speakers had some thoughts on that.
Great, thanks, Chloe. That could be anybody really of the speakers. So whoever of you wants to jump in there. Rachel or Million, maybe?
I haven't understood the question, sorry. Can she?
Yeah, so the question was really about, like, let's say we're a community of farmers, could be, I don't know, a scientist running an on-farm trial network, or it could be a village that's largely composed of sort of family farmers. And if they're thinking, oh, well, like we're stuck in this, global system where we don't have enough land to sort of grow enough crops, and the only way to market them is to sell them to the supermarket, and they don't pay us enough for our product. What are maybe some of the things that those groups of people could start to do to kind of look after themselves and get themselves out of that system? Maybe the question's too vague. If it doesn't make sense, don't answer it. No worries.
No, it's a very, very interesting question, a very important question. I mean, to whom should they sell their product? I think that's the most important question. And do they have a preference, rather, also, to say that we are only selling to this, and we're not selling to that? If I'm a farmer, and I'll be honest, I think the most important factor for me is to get the money and use that money for whatever purpose that I want. So this brings a question of organizing a community where they can have an access to other kinds of markets instead of only supermarkets. How do we do that? That's why we as an AFSA are exploring this idea of territorial markets. What's the idea of territorial markets? How can you support territorial markets so that they can support local farmers, also serve consumers? How do you create a direct linkage. I think the most important scenario would be where farmers can sell directly to consumers. That's what is agroecology, you know? When you go up to the ladder of agroecology, you have to link producers and consumers. And instead of the consumer getting their food through supermarkets and whatever, probably a processed part of the food that they get from the farmers, I think the best scenario is to connect consumers and producers, and that's one of the ultimate goals of agroecology, as I understand it.
If I may just add, this is Mvo here. If I may just add, we cannot forget the fact that the supermarket is a rather recent invention. So markets are much older than supermarkets. So I suppose if we really want to think radically about how we transform the food system, maybe we'll go back into history and see how things have been done historically, what kind of relationships we have had as a people that have not been defined by the corporate structure. So I suppose just a faith in knowing that human beings have been around for a long time and they have had many systems of exchange. So we have to think beyond what is given to us by the capitalist system, beyond extraction and developing relationships and relations that are not necessarily in the capitalist mode. It's difficult to practice. That's why I think thinking outside of the capitalist system or alternate to the capitalist system is something that we need to do.
I would simply add, I think it's a really important question, and you can see it's a difficult one to answer because we don't have the solutions. But one thing which I believe is important and has been important in the struggles of many groups, indigenous peasant groups that I know of at least, and which I read about in history, is simply the importance of coming together and engaging in forms of popular education to sharpen people's critical consciousness, their knowledge about themselves, their environment, how the outside world is impacting on their food, their farming system. The popular education that builds capabilities, skills, confidence that's needed to take things to the next stage. One important aspect of this process of transformation is the challenge of decolonizing our minds. Decolonizing our minds from an economics, which you have said is very, very narrow, parochial. It lacks the economic anthropology perspective, which Brew referred to. But equally, we need to decolonize our minds when it comes to how do we govern ourselves? Is representative democracy the model, or are there other forms of democracy, other forms of governance that might be more appropriate for local adaptive management of communities, ecosystems, place? This issue of decolonizing our minds to free ourselves from the influence of dominant discourse is very, very important. And it's very often a prerequisite. It's part of that cultural change that enables, say, technical and institutional change at a local level. The second thing I would say is that strengthening the local network, very important, but also having an eye on the larger landscape, the larger regime that is weighing on the possibilities of a particular place, a particular community has. And it's thinking hard about how do you expand freedom and possibilities at the local level, but how do you counter very negative economic, political actions coming from much, much more powerful actors? And how can communities that are much more self-aware join up and better push back and change that? So working on those two fronts seems important, but it's not the entire solution. These are two things which I've observed to be quite important in groups that have claimed space for themselves and started to walk a different path than the one which they're expected to walk in the dominant agri-food system.
Thank you,
Thank
Michel.
you.
Yeah, thank you for those questions as well. And there's quite a range of questions still there, and I'm not sure how people want to tackle this because it's almost 5 o'clock, and if people want to stay on. But if you do want to stay on, I would first like to invite Eric to make your comments on human rights-based approaches and indigenous knowledge systems. If you're still online, Eric.
Thank you very much, Nina. Mine was basically a comment because I heard, all the information about local indigenous knowledge and the rights of indigenous people. I didn't hear about the issue of, how their knowledge systems are protected, because we've got the huge challenge where we've got the multinational corporations or capitalists making significant use of this knowledge with the claim that is knowledge that is in the it's common pool resource or common pool knowledge, but once that is protected through mechanisms they've put in place, they take away that right of ownership from communities and the benefits do not really accrue to them. And I was just kind of asking whether the speakers have thought about this when it comes to the whole notion of nature-based solutions and the place of local indigenous knowledge and practices of communities and indigenous people. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Eric. Jazz, are you online and happy to respond to this?
Yeah, I'm online, and I think somebody's done a PhD on this, Nina. So you might be able to jump into. So yeah, I think it's a really good question. I think it's a fundamental question, and it is difficult because the power symmetries are so in favor of corporate power, and these laws around. I kind of. In my talk, I talked about human rights being really important, but also I think they're kind of problematic, especially in the UK, very problematic. They give it a lot of ethos to kind of intellectual property rights per se. So human rights have also been mobilized by incredibly powerful corporate actors. And this is where I think we need to step to look at it critically, and to protect human rights of indigenous people is really important because it should expand to knowledge, culture, spirituality, and territories, the whole gamut. It should apply to all. The problem, as you know, getting litigation on this and the legal personality around this is very tricky. And I think that's one of the biggest limitations in the practice of human rights. Is actually quite tricky to get those practice. A lot of states, for example, aren't signatories or haven't incorporated in their own domestic law social, cultural, and economic rights, and that includes Britain. Britain hasn't incorporated social, cultural, and economic rights in its domestic law. So in the absence of incorporation of these rights in domestic law, we've got a real problem. So and for me, I think resistance is absolutely important. So I think resistance is absolutely important, but I know somebody's done a PhD pretty much on this. So Nina, do you want to jump in?
Well, I can make a comment, I suppose. Yeah, I mean, my feeling is that it depends on how protection of knowledge is framed. And if it is framed as a kind of form of intellectual property, then we're protecting a traditional knowledge that is actually quite abstracted. And if we think of it as protecting the knowledge practices of indigenous people, then the kind of protective regime that maybe one would create around this would look quite different, and might draw on human rights based approaches, but might also not. But we'd be looking at protecting rights to land, access to land, rights to practicing their own political and justice systems in their own territories, and things that are quite different from what is often thought of as the protection of knowledge, namely as a form of intellectual property. that, you know, that there are sort of certain rights of needing to be consulted if this is being used. But it's yes, it's a complex discussion. As the very last thing, I would like to, I mean, again, you know, the discussion in the chat has also been, you know, really fascinating. But there's 3 questions that have been posed by Kirtana, Sylvia K, and Rachel Besner-Kerr. You've each asked questions around non-nature-based solutions that I'm just going to take prerogative now that I'm moderating this. I'm going to, you know, call you up on the to unmute yourselves and ask your questions out loud, because I think they hang together, and if we have them all 3 together, then maybe we can get another last set of responses from the panel, and then my feeling is that we need to close. So Kirtana, would you like to ask your question on nature-based solutions?
Sure. Hi, everyone. And first of all, thanks a lot for fantastic presentations, really beautiful, actually. And for me, it really shows that, you know, within the agroecology movement, you know, there's so much cohesion and deep thinking and understanding and exploring and really trying to transform and change systems of exploitation and, you know, colonization. And I think thinking about that, you know, what we've heard here and comparing it to what I have seen in, you know, I've been studying the rise of nature-based solutions for some time, and the way it's being promoted very heavily, especially in the UNFCCC, in the CBD COP by corporations, as I think Michel said in the beginning. It's pretty clear that, you know, it's very, very far from agroecology. And, you know, it's very, very firmly based in not just capitalist thinking, but financial capitalism. And this, you know, the idea that markets can solve all our problems. It's really based in that kind of logic. So I guess, you know, my thinking is that a lot of the time we hear about safeguards. You know, we can have NBS, but with safeguards that make it better, you know, rights, or can we make it more like the principles of agroecology? And I fear that that's just not going to be possible. You know, that we can't, it was conceived to be it's a different beast from what agroecology is. And I guess, so my question, leading on from all that, is that, can we really win this fight? And is that the strategy to go in with, really, that, you know, try to say that agroecology can be an NBS, when anyway, it's a tiny, tiny part. Most of NBS is basically red and plantations. You know, even if agroecology was discussed, it would be the smallest part and linked to carbon markets, probably. So, I mean, it's very obvious what my view is, but I genuinely want to hear, because it's a very new subject. So I'm very interested to hear how other people are thinking about this and what really is the strategy, what our strategy should be.
Thank you, Kirtana. Sylvia, you had a related question, I think. Maybe you just want to pose it. I'll have to ask you to be really concise because there is so little time.
Of course, yeah, no, thanks. And actually, like Kirtana did actually kind of elaborate a bit in the chat and answered some of my questions about it. But it was just to understand really to what extent like the fundamental premise of nature-based solutions is flawed. If it's, yeah, so it seemed to be really rooted in this kind of market mechanisms and financialization of nature. And then I guess if that's the case, then yes, you know, I guess a resistance strategy on all fronts is merited. And I was just kind of wanting to understand that a bit more. To what extent is the premise and the fundamental logic of nature-based solutions based on that thinking, and therefore a resistance strategy is warranted. But perhaps if I may, just one final question was just a bit to understand a bit more the logic of the conservation NGOs in nature-based solutions. Like, is it based on this idea of like selling nature to save it? Is that why they're pushing for it? Or if anyone can say a bit more about that, I would like to understand that a bit more. Thanks.
Thanks, Sylvia. And then we had Rachel Besner-Kerr, not Rachel, the panelist. Did you want to pose your question as well? Maybe Rachel is not there anymore. So I'm going to read out that question. It was posed to Michel and Rachel. These are very welcome critiques of nature-based solutions, but I wonder if the critiques are similar to that of a diluted agroecology. That is, without attending to human rights and food sovereignty, it is ineffective, but it does have potential as a concept. So this is the question, is it ineffective but has potential or not? And I think these three questions were very much related, and I would ask the panel to step up and maybe give some very concise answers, and maybe we can go through all of the panelists to answer the question as to whether nature-based solutions should be combated or should be embraced, or to what extent they can be embraced.
Nina, perhaps I'll start.
Great.
And yeah, I get it's a complex question. And I think that nature-based solutions are defined really differently by different actors. And this is probably part of the reason why we come to different answers. But certainly the mainstream, the IUCN standard, the fact that it's now embedded in the language of Nestle and Unilever and many other companies, means that the concept has become one that is strongly linked with financialization and a corporate-led agenda. And we're seeing that in the COP meetings. You know, it's reached a different scale. And I think the question of scale is a really interesting one, which we haven't touched on. Because if one looks at the practices of what's being proposed, one can't chuck everything out. You know, they're definitely at a local level. If one's talking about soil regeneration without the use of inputs, it's something that's a principle that is very much embedded within agroecology. And we know that local people have, custodians of resources, have deeply traditional practices of managing and caring for the land. And some of those practices are now weaving themselves into the nature-based solution narrative. So I feel ambiguous about throwing everything out, because I think some of those practices are really important. But certainly as a concept, and the way in which it is embedding itself in narratives, particularly at an international level, is something we absolutely have to resist and think of strategies to do so.
Thanks, Rachel. Moo, are you there? Maybe you could step in and say something.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no, I think Rachel's point is both Rachel, by the way. I think your points are on point, that the move towards nature-based solutions, if we are smart, if we're intelligent, there might be cracks and openings in the system. I think we need to be clever and see how we can take advantage of the crevices in this move, because there will be money, there will be resources, and we need to be clever like serpents in seeing how we can take advantage of those cracks and crevices. It should be silly to say all nature-based solutions, if they are propounded by the mighty, are necessarily evil, and we should, just get rid of it. I think that would be foolhardy. What we need to think about is how we can take advantage of the cracks and openings in this way of thinking, because this is also credit to us that after so many years of advocacy, of research and fighting, the powers that be are beginning to acknowledge that there's something there, that the system as it currently has been is not going to sustain us as a people. And therefore, if they affect the system, we should welcome those and take advantage of them. And to me, it's similar to asking whether we should jettison the idea of democracy because it's been practiced so badly, right? Or the idea that we should jettison the market because the market is so bad, instead of seeing how we can take advantage of the openings that are there. We've done a lot of work to get us here, that those that are in power are beginning to admit that something is off, and therefore we need to see how we can take advantage of those cracks.
Great, thank you. There's like more questions and more discussion coming on the chat, but I really feel we should wrap it up now. I don't know if any of the panelists would like to make some final comments to our last questions on whether nature-based solutions should be embraced or combated. If not, I think we'll wrap it up.
Can I say something here?
Yes, Million, please go for it.
Yeah, I try to look at some of the definitions, I think from the FAO on nature-based solution, and they talk about mostly about forests and selling nature to save it is very important. I'm just laughing. I think we're talking about agroecology in terms of transformation. We have to understand what agroecology is. You can go to a single farm and you can call that farm climate resilient agriculture, sustainable agriculture, and whatever. But agroecology has 3 elements, and one of these 3 elements is overlooked mostly. This social movement element. Why do we have social movement as one of the pillars, as one of the legs of agroecology? Because basically, I mean, in the context of the bigger food sovereignty, I think we are talking about power relationship, power between those who have a lot of power in so many kinds of power, and those who have not. So that's where, in this social movement, that's where you bring in the rights issue also, as Jas was explaining. The rights issue, right to food, is a very critical component of agroecology. Right to land, right to seed, right to water is such a critical component of agroecology. It's not only the practice of producing healthy food, diverse food, whatever. So where does nature-based solution comes in terms of this rights agenda, this social movement agenda? We don't have it there. So you cannot equate agroecology and nature-based solution. It will be unpalatable, it will be difficult, you see. And I was participating in COP25 in Spain, and Shell and these big companies, Shell, Total, they all have this big banner, of meetings, nature-based solution. Then you could ask yourself, what do they mean by nature-based solution? So yeah, that's what my answer is.
Thank you, Million. Given that it is 5:15, and even though we started late, I think we need to wrap it up here. But it was, really great, and I find it quite hard to stop the discussion. I really hope that we'll see many of you back next week. Of course, all our early careers researchers are forced to be there, but some of you that have joined us from other places, it would be great to see you then next week with our final webinar on resourcing agroecology. So yeah, thank you very much. I don't think I need to say any more. Thank you to the panelists.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.